לאורחים שלנו מחו"ל או הלא ישראלים שהגיעו אלינו. בבקשה.
תודה רבה, חבר הכנסת נחמן שי, לכל חברי הכנסת שנמצאים איתנו, השגרירים, גם הצוות נאמנה של NGO Monitor שטרח הרבה, ואחרת לא היינו יושבים כאן איתם. I will now speak in English, despite my allegiance to Lashon Kodesh, but I will speak in English because I'd like to be able to introduce or to pave the way for some comments from the ambassador from the European Union and from others that we're honored to have seating at the table, the ambassador from Canada and others. I'm going to leave the history of Durban to the historians. There's a lot to be said, and we've had a little bit of it. I'll just tell you briefly my own connection. I was in Canada in June. I heard from a senior member of the Canadian government that Canada was planning, along with the European Union and the UN, to sponsor this tremendous conference to celebrate the end of the apartheid era in South Africa and to begin what was called the complete elimination of racism and discrimination from the face of the earth. And there was going to be, in addition to a diplomatic conference and a youth conference, they were also going to invite the heads of non-governmental human rights organizations like Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and others. And I came back from that meeting basically and said, oy vey. I said to the Foreign Ministry, this was 15 years ago. I spoke to members of the Prime Minister's office. I'm not sure if I spoke to then Deputy Foreign Minister Rav Melchior before or afterwards, but there was nobody to talk to. And exactly the same. They asked me would I join the delegation, and I said it's too late. That this is going to be something, I won't claim to have foreseen that 15 years later we'd be sitting around this table talking about this tremendous operation, but it was clear that this was a major event. And what we learned was that this was all prepared in Tehran. The United Nations Human Rights Commission at the time held its preparatory conference in Tehran for what later became Durban. I just want to reiterate a couple of quick points before we turn to the ambassadors. Durban Conference was not physically just a celebration of anti-Semitism, as Professor Erwin Kotler, who I guess is not here with us, but you saw in the film, said at the time, and he was part of their major figure in the Canadian delegation, later became the Attorney General, that this was an anti-racism conference used for racism, but it was the foundation of the BDS movement. And the language that was used to refer to Israel as an apartheid state repeatedly, the term comes up in three little short sections of the final declaration of that NGO forum. Crimes against humanity, racist crimes, ethnic cleansing, genocide, that was the beginning of BDS. And the very specific call on all these organizations, we're talking about Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, major Palestinian groups, which I'll refer to in a minute, sponsored by the UN, by the European Union, by the Canadian government. I think all of them were as equally surprised by this. Call on the complete isolation of the international community to impose a policy of complete and total isolation of Israel as an apartheid state. And for the last 15 years, we've been seeing this policy slowly implemented. We've seen it in the BDS movement, we've seen it in lawfare, we've seen it in the type of posters and caricatures that we often see. If you'll go to the next click, please, hopefully the caricature will show up. Go back one. The image that we have here from an organization which is funded by what's called the International Humanitarian Law and the Secretariat, a group called Badil, with a very large budget from 4 European countries. And this is the image that they have, one of their posters. And there you can see this is not exactly a two-state solution. This is not a 1967 agenda. There are many examples of the anti-Semitism that have grown part of this, almost to the point where people don't even notice that it's taking place. Dov, if you can go to the next slide, please. These are just some of the images, and we've seen it over from NGOs. The first one on my left is from Oxfam, and in many different languages. The blood orange, the Jews are squeezing the blood, and don't visit. This is also a BDS poster. The blatant anti-Semitism in the middle, adopting the images of Der Stürmer, of the Holocaust, and using them against, as part of that whole movement to demonize Israel. The Christmas cards that we see, theological themes, all of these are promoted by NGOs. The amount of money that goes into this is very significant. That's what NGO Monitor has followed. Al-Haq, one of the prominent organizations, which gets funding from a number of governments and humanitarian aid organizations, which leads the campaign to bring Israelis to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. That's the abuse of justice, the principles of justice, the institutions of justice, primarily for this type of political war. I'd like to end my comments on a positive note and simply point out the successes that are being felt, and I think because of this broad coalition which is developed. If you go to the next slide, please. the end, I think we may be seeing the beginning of the end of the Durban strategy. When the Parliament of Holland last week votes and tells the government to investigate the abuses of the funding and stop using any Dutch funding for BDS, that's an important stage. When American state governments pass anti-BDS legislation, when the British government says that any BDS funding for any government contract is illegal. And finally, I'll just mention the fact that in Switzerland, there's also going to be another vote that's going to take place. The Swiss Parliament, this is from a leading Swiss newspaper, investigating the use of NGO funding, of government funding, for a campaign against Israel. So I think we have reason to be optimistic. I think the work that's being done by the members of the Knesset, by the Minister Erdan and others, is moving us in the right direction. Thank you all very much.
Would you like? Okay. Ambassador Lars Farbrug Anderson, English is the way to bring you into this discussion. Thank you, Gerald.